Okay, so I'm gonna probably do a little double on this day in history because the on this day in history for today actually ties into the on this day in history from yesterday. Oh shoot, you can totally see my hand paint. I helped my mom paint the bathroom today. Anyway, so on this day in history, Plessy versus Ferguson is ruled in 1896. Now, um, the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so this is a Supreme Court ruling. Plessy versus Ferguson, and basically the big thing that you need to take out from this is the when the Supreme Court deemed that separate but equal was okay. So the U.S. Supreme Court rules 7-1 that a Louisiana law providing equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races was okay. So this ruling in 1896 will stand until 1954 when Brown versus the Board of Education is passed. So what this basically said is that as long as accommodations are provided, segregation was not discrimination. Now, if we were in class, I would say, do you actually think things were equal for Black folks or colored folks? And the answer is no, right? It was not equal. That's why it eventually had to be taken down because this was not something that was okay. So African Americans were not being deprived of equal protection under the law as guaranteed by the 14th Amendment because you have to remember about 30 years before this, the Civil War happened and I think three amendments were passed, basically deeming that slavery and any sort of racial discrimination was unlawful. Well, this Supreme Court ruling basically deemed that the segregation was not unlawful. So the federal government officially tolerated this idea of separate but equal. They used it to justify segregation throughout the South. And then colored facilities were never actually equal. So you can see here, like there's two different drinking fountains, and then there's a colored waiting room, and there would have been a white waiting room. And this is where we get a lot of kind of the civil rights movement stems out of. I mean, not only this specific idea, a lot of hundreds of years of oppression in a country, but also this sort of doctrine, this sort of Supreme Court case that makes things lawful. So that's what you need to understand is that they were not technically breaking the law, which is I mean, to me, it feels embarrassing a little bit that this was something that lasted in our country until 1954. Like our grandparents were alive in the 50s, maybe. Most of you probably have grandparents that were alive in the 50s. So it just is something that makes my heart hurt a little bit. So yesterday in history actually was Brown versus the Board of Education is decided in 1954. So I feel like this is a great time to talk about this. So this was a major civil rights victory. The U.S. hands down a unanimous, all of them voted, decision ruling against segregation in public education facilities. They deemed it unconstitutional. So what was happening were students were having to be bused to schools because there wasn't a segregated school for them. So it was just not. Obviously it was time for it to be done, but also it was not okay. So this brought an end to the tolerance of racial segregation, federal racial segregation. Linda Brown, which is this little girl right here, was denied admission to her local elementary school in Topeka, Kansas. And again, that's what I was saying. So they wouldn't have been able, like, for example, those of you that went to Blue Oak, you wouldn't have been able to go to Blue Oak if you were, let's say that you were African American and it was a white school. You would not have been able to go to Blue Oak. You would have been bused to a different school, which seems weird to us, but that was how things worked. I have 30 more seconds. So her case was taken up by the NAACP, which is the African American Association. It reached the Supreme Court with the American lawyer we know, Thurgood Marshall. We've had it on this day about him before. And then Chief Justice Earl Warren read the decision, deeming that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional and officially ended the precedent set by Plessy versus Ferguson, which I just talked about. And if you remember,